It was 8:47 on a Wednesday morning when the woman in the borrowed blazer raised her hand and said quietly that there might be a problem with her application file. Bernard Cloutier turned from the whiteboard. He looked at her the way people look at a parking ticket, an inconvenience, nothing more. "Your file is fine, Miss Okafor." He said the name the way people say a word in a language they find difficult. "The committee reviewed it last night, I understand," she said. "But the portfolio attached isn't mine." He exhaled through his nose, a slow, theatrical exhale. He looked at the other 7 candidates seated at the long oak table in the Harmon Center boardroom. All of them there for the final interview round of the Bellevue Architecture Fellowship, the most competitive design residency in Quebec. And he smiled at them the way a teacher smiles at a class when one student asks the wrong question. "Miss Okafor," he said, "the file has your name on it." "Yes, sir, but the drawings inside are not my drawings." The room went very still. Her name was Priya Okafor, 26 years old. The daughter of a woman who had cleaned offices on the night shift at a downtown Montreal tower for 19 years, and a father who had driven freight from Toronto to Halifax so many times he could tell you the elevation of every rest stop in New Brunswick. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Verdun. She had done her undergrad at Concordia on a combination of bursaries, student loans, and the money her mother set aside from each paycheck in a mason jar on the kitchen counter labeled, in her mother's careful handwriting, for Priya's drawings. She had graduated top of her class. She had worked 3 years at a small firm in St. Henry, designing social housing retrofits and community centers in neighborhoods that the big firms didn't bother with. She had applied to the Bellevue Fellowship on the strength of a community library she had designed from scratch for a Cree settlement, 2 hours north of Val d'Or. A building that had won a regional award, that had been featured in Canadian Architect magazine, that had made a retired professor at McGill write a personal letter to the fellowship committee, calling it one of the most thoughtful pieces of community architecture he had seen in 20 years. That letter was in her file. She had read it with her mother at the kitchen table, and her mother had pressed both palms flat on the table as she read it, as if to keep herself from floating. Cloutier had been on the fellowship committee for 11 years. He had been the lead partner at Cloutier Masson Architectes for 23. He was not a bad architect. He was, in fact, a technically excellent one. His firm designed glass towers and civic monuments and the kinds of buildings that got photographed from helicopters. He had opinions about everything. He gave workshops at McGill and Laval. He was the kind of man who had never, not once, been the least impressive person in a room, until, he sensed dimly, this particular Wednesday morning, 6 weeks before the fellowship interview, at a dinner party at the home of one of the committee members, Cloutier had mentioned Priya Okafor by name. Not warmly. He had looked at the portfolio image on his colleague's phone, a photograph of the library in Val d'Or, its curved cedar walls rising from a snowfield, its windows facing exactly northeast to catch the morning light, and he had said, "It's competent, but she's not ready. Community projects are a nice start. But this fellowship isn't charity. The committee would be doing her a disservice, putting her up against candidates with real institutional experience." His colleague had looked at him for a moment and then looked away. 2 days later, Cloutier had accessed the submission portal to review all 8 candidate files. He had that access. He was entitled to it. What he had done with 5 minutes alone in that portal, a minor adjustment, a file swap replacing Priya's library drawings with a set of generic student drafts pulled from a university server, was something else entirely. He had not thought anyone would notice before the room read from the files. He had not thought the woman from Verdun would come in having memorized every dimension of her own work. But Priya Okafor had not slept much the night before. She had been at her kitchen table at 11, going over her portfolio one more time. Not from anxiety, exactly, but because she had learned, early and permanently, that preparation was the only leverage she had ever owned. She had opened the fellowship portal to review the submission confirmation. She had clicked through to her attached file. She had stared at the screen for a long time. The drawings were not hers. They were not even close. They were flat, generic, technically adequate, student-grade plans for a mid-rise residential building. No community consultation notes, no site-specific material choices, no northeast-facing windows, no cedar, no snow. She had closed the laptop. She had sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for 1 minute and 40 seconds. Then she had opened it again and taken screenshots of every page. Then she had called her mother. Her mother, whose name was Adace, was still awake. She worked a 4 to midnight shift and never slept before 2. She listened to everything. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Do you know what you need to bring tomorrow?" "Yes." "Do you know what you're going to say?" "Yes." "Then go to sleep. You need to be sharp." Priya had gone to sleep. She had been sharp. Now in the boardroom, with Cloutier's exhale still hanging in the air, she reached into the leather satchel at her feet, borrowed from a colleague, the same colleague whose blazer she was wearing, and she set a folder on the table. She opened it. She slid a printed screenshot across the polished oak toward the committee chair. A woman named Dr. Suzanne Fortin, who was also the head of the architecture school at Université de Montréal, and who had herself spent 15 years designing indigenous community spaces before moving into academia. These are screenshots from the fellowship portal, time-stamped as of last night at 11:14. Priya said, "This is what was attached to my name. These are not my drawings." She slid a second sheet across. "These are my drawings. The library at the Abitibi Lake settlement, completed 18 months ago. You may have seen the feature in Canadian Architect." She laid both sets side by side. The room looked at them. Dr. Fortin looked at them for a long time without speaking. The architect to her left leaned over to look. The one to her right did the same. Cloutier said, "Clearly there's been a technical error in the portal system." "Perhaps," Priya said. She said it without heat, without drama, the way someone says perhaps when they are keeping a very large door closed for the moment. The committee took a 15-minute recess. In the corridor, Priya stood by a window that looked out over Rue Sherbrooke. It was February. The snow was the specific gray-white of Montreal February, the kind that stops being beautiful around the 4th day. She had a paper cup of coffee from the cart in the lobby downstairs, and she held it with both hands. She did not call anyone. She did not check her phone. She stood at the window and drank her coffee and watched the street, the way a person watches a street when they have already made every decision they needed to make, and the rest is just waiting. A woman on the committee, a younger architect named Sophie Gendron Lafleur, who had been quiet during the exchange, came to stand beside her. She didn't say anything immediately. Then she said, "That library, the orientation of the windows, was that from community consultation or your own reading of the site?" "Both," Priya said. "The elders told me people get up before dawn in the winter. They wanted to see the sun rise from inside. I went out to the site at 5:30 in the morning 3 times to check the angle." Sophie Gendron Lafleur nodded once. Then she went back inside. Cloutier, in a room down the hall with 2 members of the committee and the fellowship's administrative director, was explaining that the portal system had experienced a documented glitch the previous week. He had a note about it somewhere, and that the wrong file had almost certainly been auto-populated by a system error, and that, of course, this was unfortunate. And of course, the process should continue as scheduled, because delaying the fellowship round would disadvantage all 8 candidates, not just one, and it would be unfair to the others too. Dr. Fortin walked in. She had a sheet of paper in her hand. "Bernard," she said, "the portal logs access by user account, with timestamps." She set the paper on the table. He looked at it. His face did not do what faces do when someone encounters an unexpected piece of information. It did what faces do when someone encounters an expected piece of information they had hoped would not arrive. He said, "I was reviewing all the files. That's within my committee access." "Reviewing, yes." Dr. Fortin folded her hands. "Replacing takes a different set of permissions, which you also have, and which the log shows were used." Cloutier said nothing. "I've asked the administrative director to pull the full access record," she said. "It will take about an hour. In the meantime, I think the fairest thing is to proceed with the interviews using the correct files, with your participation suspended pending the review." She said all of this the way a surgeon describes a procedure, clearly, precisely, without any more drama than the situation required. Cloutier stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He said, with the particular dignity of a man who has run out of pivots, "I stand by the quality of this committee's process." No one answered him. He walked out. The door closed. Now here is the part that people want to skip past, because it is less satisfying than the boardroom, but it is the part that matters. Priya's interview was the 4th of the day. She walked back in at 2 in the afternoon. after a morning of sitting in a borrowed blazer in a corridor, drinking and watching the city, and she sat down at the long oak table, and she answered every question she was asked. Dr. Fortin asked her about the material choice for the library. Why cedar? Why that thickness? What was the thermal performance in a northern Quebec winter? She answered. Specifically, she knew the R values. She knew the sourcing. She knew the name of the mill and the name of the man at the mill. And the fact that he had never sold cedar to an architect before, and had called her back 3 days later to ask if she would talk to his daughter, who was thinking about studying design. Sophie Gendron Lafleur asked about the consultation process with the settlement community. How long? How many sessions? What had surprised her? She talked for 4 minutes about a conversation she'd had with a woman in her 70s who had said she wanted a library that didn't look like the government. She said every building the government ever built for them looked like an apology. She wanted something that looked like it wanted to be there. Priya had gone back to her sketchbook that night and thrown out everything she had drawn up to that point and started again. A third committee member, a structural engineer from the firm that had designed the new Champlain Bridge approaches, asked her a technical question about load distribution in curved wooden structures in high snow load environments. It was a hard question, a gotcha question, the kind someone asks when they want to see whether a candidate knows where their knowledge ends. She answered it correctly, and then she said, the span I was most uncertain about, I ran past a timber engineer at Laval 3 times. Here are her notes. She pulled a page from the folder in front of her and slid it across. I would always rather show the consultation than hide the uncertainty. The structural engineer looked at the notes. He turned them over. He set them down. He didn't say anything immediately. At 3:22 in the afternoon, Priya walked out of the Harmon Center and stood on the sidewalk on Rue Sherbrooke and called her mother. Her mother picked up on the second ring. She was at work in the break room in her cleaning uniform. How was it? I think it went well. A pause. Did you say everything you needed to say? Yes. Did you leave anything on the table? No. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, I have to go back in. Call me tonight. Priya stood on the sidewalk for another minute. The February gray had softened a little in the afternoon light. Not beautiful, but less gray. She took the metro home. What happened next took 3 days, not 90 seconds. The Fellowship Administrative Office completed its portal access review. The log showed a file replacement executed from Cloutier's account at 11:07 p.m. on a Thursday night, 6 days before the interview. There was no system glitch. The IT director stated this in writing. The committee met without Cloutier. They voted. The Bellevue Fellowship was awarded to Priya Okafor. The margin was not close. The Fellowship Board also voted to refer the access log to the Ordre des Architectes du Québec, which opened a professional conduct file. That process would take months, maybe longer. These things always do. Cloutier retained a lawyer. He issued a statement through his firm's communications office about the importance of fairness and process and his confidence in the OAQ's review. The statement used the word unfortunate 4 times. It did not use the word sorry. His name is still on his firm. That part of the story is not finished yet. But on the morning after the fellowship decision was announced, a Friday, cold, the kind of cold that turns your breath into a small cloud that disappears before you've finished a thought, Priya Okafor sat at the kitchen table in Verdun across from her mother. Her mother had made rice and stew, not because it was a special occasion exactly, because that was what she made when something important happened, something requiring a meal that takes time and attention and smells like the people who taught you to cook it. Priya had her fellowship letter on the table. She had not framed it. She had not photographed it for anything. It was just there, between the salt shaker and her mother's mug. Her mother read it a second time. She set it down. She picked up her spoon. The cedar mill man, she said. The one who called you about his daughter? Yes? Did you write back? Priya looked at her. I wrote back the same day. Her mother nodded. She ate. She said nothing more for a while. Outside, a bus went by. The 61, which her mother took to work and back every shift, which Priya had taken 10,000 times as a child, and they listened to it pass. That building, her mother said eventually, in the settlement. Does it still look the way you drew it? Priya thought about it. She had been back once since it opened, the previous spring. She had driven up on a Saturday and parked and just stood outside for a while. The cedar had already started to weather. It was darker than it had been. The northeast windows caught the morning light, exactly as she had calculated, a long, pale stripe across the reading room floor, moving slowly as the sun lifted. An elder she had worked with during the consultation had come out the front door while she was standing there. He had looked at her, and then at the building, and then back at her. He had said, in English because his French was limited and hers in his language was non-existent, "You got the light right." She had driven home with the windows down even though it was cold. "It looks better," she told her mother. The cedar aged. Her mother looked up. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "Good wood does that," she said. "It gets better the longer it stands. That is the part that stays with you. Not the boardroom, not the portal log, not the vote. The part about the wood. Somewhere out there right now, there is a person who went back to a thing they made. A project, a proof, a piece of work, and found it still standing. Still true. Better for the time that had passed over it. If that is you, keep going. The people trying to replace your file with something lesser are betting you won't notice. Notice. Print the screenshots. Call your mother. Walk back in. The light will be where you calculated it would be.